Have you ever heard of Jesse Applegate? Well, if you haven't, don't worry. I imagine most of the grown-ups in your life haven't either. Now, I created the following lesson for my daughter's second grade class. Her teacher told me that they were learning about pioneers, and I said, "Oh, that's amazing. Are you going to cover Jesse Applegate?" And he said, "No." So he asked if I would like to go in and teach the class all about this amazing pioneer. And of course, I said yes. Now, my grandma said she wished that she could see my lesson, so that's why I'm recording it now. So, Grandma, this one's for you. All right, so Jesse Applegate, he is the person who made the Applegate Trail. It's a really cool story. So here's a picture of Jesse Applegate. Now that kind of looks like a funny picture because it's actually a drawing. Now, what's weird is there are no actual photographs of Jesse Applegate. Weird, huh? So he was a very important person, but I would say he was also a very important pioneer. He was born in July of 1811. Now, depending on when you're watching this video, that was 211 years ago. And then he died in April of 1888 when he was 76. Now, in his 76 years of life, he did some cool stuff, and I'm going to tell you about the coolest. Now, when he was born, he lived in Kentucky with his family. He had a whole bunch of brothers and sisters, and he was the very youngest. And when he was 10 years old, the family moved to St. Louis, Missouri. And I'm going to show you a map in a minute to show you where St. Louis, Missouri is. Now, he was very smart. This was a very smart kid, one of those kids where the grown-ups notice, like, wow, he's way smarter than most kids his age. And so he got to do a lot more schooling than his siblings because they wanted to make sure he really met his potential. So when he was a teenager, he got a job, and where he worked, a whole lot of really important people would come in to see his boss. And so when they would come in, they would stop and have conversations with a young Jesse Applegate. And he learned about politics, lots of government stuff. And he also met some people who had been over in Oregon country. Now, Oregon country probably sounds like a really weird way to say Oregon. But I'll explain that in a minute too. So anyway, they would tell him about their adventures over in Oregon country, and he thought that was pretty cool. Now, eventually, Jesse Applegate grew up, he got married, he had some kids, he had his very own farm, and he also worked as a surveyor. Now, you might think that a surveyor goes around and asks people, do you prefer mac and cheese or pizza? And you're not wrong, but this kind of surveyor was different. So you probably see this picture on your screen. These are really old tools that surveyors used, and they would measure the ground. They would see the flat parts and the bumpy parts, and they would help plan where cities and towns would be built. So a surveyor would take some measurements and they'd say, oh, this area is perfect for building a school, or this area is good for a neighborhood, or this would be a perfect place to put in the main street of a town. So that's the type of stuff that Jesse Applegate got to do. So he would go out in the countryside. He would leave the city of St. Louis and go out in the country, and he would do his measurements because he was a surveyor. So now his tools, those are not his tools in the picture, but he had some just like that. And his are actually in a museum now in Independence, Oregon. So anyway, today surveyors have way more high-tech tools. They have tools now that, probably have batteries and turn on and off, but this is the type of tool that Jesse Applegate had to use. So here is a map. Now, you probably recognize this as the United States, right? But here's the crazy part. In 1840, only this part here in red was the United States. That was the shape of our country at the time. You can see here, this is Florida territory. Now we know that it's, the state of Florida. But back in 1840, it wasn't a state yet. It was just a territory. And then here, this was unorganized territory. It was just lots of land and nature. And over here, you see Oregon country. So this was not a territory of the United States yet. In fact, there was another country, Great Britain, which is way across the ocean. They also wanted Oregon country. And so at the time in 1840, nobody really knew who was going to get that land. And so they called that the Oregon Question. Now, if you're familiar with the shape of Oregon, you know that this is Oregon and this is Washington, this is Idaho. But at the time, all of this was called Oregon country. Now, some people were over there. Actually, in the 1820s, some people started moving over there and having homes, but never before had a whole big group of people all decided to move there all at once. So I'm going to show you where Jesse Applegate lived in St. Louis, Missouri. He was over on this side of the state right there. And eventually where he wanted to go was way over here at the Willamette Valley in Oregon. I live in the Willamette Valley. So anyway, that's where he wanted to go. And that's over 2,000 miles away. And here's the thing, when people wanted to go to Oregon country, they had to, ride a horse or had to walk. And that's what the pioneers had to do. They had to walk. They could go only as fast as their cows could walk. So it was pretty slow going, and it took them about 6 months. That's half of a year to get all that way. Now, 2,000 miles, if you wanted to try to walk 2,000 miles, you would have to go out to the track that's behind your school. If you have a track at your school, you would have to go around it 8,000 times to go 2,000 miles. It's pretty crazy. Now, you might be wondering why people wanted to leave Missouri and go to Oregon country. And I don't know all of their reasons for all of the people, but I know why Jesse Applegate wanted to leave Missouri. So I'm going to tell you all about it. Now, first of all, probably the biggest reason was that Jesse did not like slavery at all. Now, he had, a big farm, and his neighbors also had farms, but those other farmers, they were also slave owners. And Jesse thought it was terrible. And so Jesse, he would not own a slave, no way. And so he actually would hire people and pay them money, to come and help him work on his farm. And there came a time where there weren't enough people to hire. There weren't enough people looking for jobs, And so he actually, to get all of the harvesting done or the planting or whatever it was, he actually had to borrow slaves from his neighbors. And he felt terrible about that. Absolutely terrible. So he wanted nothing to do with slavery, and he wanted to get out of Missouri. Now, another thing, at the time in the 1840s, the economy was really struggling. And basically, there wasn't enough money to go around. So even if he could have hired people to help him, he wouldn't have money to pay them. He would have to, pay them with the corn he grew or things like that. Even the stores didn't have enough money to buy more products to put on their shelves. It was a really tough time. And in the past, Jesse Applegate, like his family members before him, whenever this type of thing happened, they would just kind of move to a new place, settle somewhere else, and it seemed to get better. So he thought, hey, now might be a good time to head over to Oregon country. Now, here's another one. This is crazy. So here in Oregon, and probably wherever you are watching this, in the winter time, that's when people catch colds. Like, it's called cold and flu season, right? In the winter. But in Missouri, in the 1840s, it came in the summer, but it wasn't just a cold or the flu. They were catching malaria and cholera, and tons of people would get sick, like really, really sick. And a bunch of people would actually die. And most of them were children. So it was very, very sad. So Jesse Applegate did not want to have to go through that anymore. And so anyway, those friends of his that had been over to Oregon country, They told him that there was no summer fever over in Oregon. So that sounded really, really great. And then here's another reason. So remember, they weren't really sure who was going to be in charge of Oregon country, if it was going to be part of Great Britain or part of the United States. They didn't know. And so people could just kind of go over there and just build a farm or do whatever, and they didn't have to really answer to anybody. So it was just kind of free for the taking. So that was also pretty appealing. And then this one's cool too. He just really wanted to check it out because some of those people that he met were fur trappers. And fur trappers were like, I'll explain it. So let's say a fur trapper lives in Missouri. And then when the weather gets really nice, it's spring and summer, they'll ride their horse over to Oregon country and they will catch beavers, for example, or bears, things like that. And they would kill the animal and then take their skin, their fur. And when it started to get cold again, it was going to be wintertime. Then they would travel back to Missouri and they would sell those furs. And then the money they got for the furs, they'd buy more supplies so they could do it again. Year after year, they would do it again. So anyway, Jesse saw beaver furs and he was like, this is such an interesting animal. And so then the trappers would say, yeah, they're really cool. They cut down trees with their teeth and they build dams in the creeks. And this is what it's like where they live. And so Jesse was like, that sounds really neat. Because these were exotic animals that they didn't have in Missouri. And so he just really thought it would be cool just to see it and be there. So all of these reasons contributed to what became known as the Applegate itchy foot. That might sound very uncomfortable, having itchy feet, but this was not a sickness that he had. This was a funny way of saying that all of the Applegate people, like Jesse and his brothers and their dad, and then his dad and his dad, and all the way back to the very first Applegate to set foot on this continent, they always liked to go past the boundaries and check out the frontier and move and not stay in one place. So it was just a funny thing to say, like, oh, he's got itchy feet, there he goes again. So anyway, Jesse Applegate got the Applegate itchy foot. Now he talked to his brothers and he was like, guys, we should totally just pack up and get out of here. And they had talked about it for like a year or so, like planning this out of here's what we'll do and we'll go. And he had more brothers that he also talked to about it, but only these two went with him. So this is Charles Applegate and this is Lindsay Applegate. And again, this is Jesse Applegate. So they even put an ad in the paper in Missouri and they were like, we're doing this thing. We're going to move to Oregon country. And if you want to come with us, you totally should. And they said, we are going to meet at a place called Independence, Missouri, which was actually on the other side of the state from where he lived. But he was like, we're going to pack up our stuff. We're going to get our cows and our wives and our kids. And we are going to meet up in Independence, Missouri. And we're going to get organized. And so that's what they did. Now, I did mention cows, right? So these three brothers had a lot of cows and a lot of more people even brought cows. So among these three brothers, when they put their cows together, it was like 800 cows. That is so many cows that we're going to have to walk all the way from Missouri to Oregon country. Wow. So anyway, they showed up in Independence, Missouri to get organized. And there were about 120 of these covered wagons. And there were like over 1,000 people because, their families, they had the wives and the kids and stuff. And then so many cows, right? Oh, gracious. And so they had to put all of their supplies that they needed in these wagons. And everything else, they just had to leave behind in Missouri. They couldn't take it. So what did they have to pack? Basically everything to keep them alive for 6 months of walking across nature. And that's, I mean, imagine the planning that had to go into that. Not only did they have to take, food and, pots and pans to cook food over a fire and clothes and things like that, they also had to take supplies that they would need when they got to Oregon country, because they weren't going over and buying a farm that was already there. They weren't, buying houses that were there. There weren't really stores over there to go and buy stuff. So they had to take all their tools, they had to take nails, they had to take whatever they were going to need to start from scratch and build things when they got there. So they had to really plan out what they were going to take with them. So here is a map showing where they went. So Independence, Missouri was over here. And so they had to go all this way, all those people, all those wagons, all those cows, all the way over here to the Willamette Valley. Now, keep in mind, these states were not states at the time. This is just to show you, so you can kind of visualize where across the land they had traveled. Now, when they first started, here's Missouri, this is Kansas, okay? It wasn't Kansas then, but when they were in this area, something very crazy happened. So here you go. At night, they had to circle up the wagons like you see here, but it was way more wagons. It was 120 wagons, right? So they had to circle up the wagons, and they would connect each wagon to the one in front of it. And then inside the circle is where they would put their cows and, horses and stuff like that, because they didn't have fences just out there in the countryside. So they kept them all safe in there. Now, one night when they were in that Kansas area, there was a crazy thunderstorm that kicked up. I lived in Kansas for 2 years, and those thunderstorms are crazy. They are scary. I mean, even though they don't always turn into tornadoes, still, if you look up in the sky, you can see the clouds just churning and moving so fast, and they're very intimidating. So here's this thunderstorm one night, okay? And the lightning is just flashing and flashing and flashing, and the thunder is just crashing and crashing and crashing. And what do you think the cows did? Think about how scary that would be for cows, because they don't understand, right? Well, they freaked out and did some smashing. They knocked over some wagons and got loose. And when morning came around, everything was soaking wet from all the rain, and the cows were gone. So that whole day, the men had to get on their horses, and they had to ride for miles to go and find these cows and bring them back to the wagon train. And they also had to fix everything that was broken and, pick up everything that got knocked over and everything. And so this started a really big disagreement, because the people who didn't bring cows, they didn't want to travel with cows. They were like, these cows are going to slow us down. Look what just happened. We lost a whole day where we could have been walking toward Oregon country. We lost a whole day having to go and get these cows and fix what they broke and everything. So there was a big disagreement. And eventually they decided to split into 2 groups. So now there's one group of pioneers that does not have lots of cows, and they are called the light column. And then there was the other group of pioneers that did have tons and tons and tons of cows, and they were called the cow column. And so the light column said, we're going to get there so much faster than you because we don't have cows to slow us down. And so they split. Now, Jesse Applegate, he was elected as the captain of the cow column. And that means he was the leader. So if there was ever a disagreement or like a question of like, should we do this or should we do that or whatever, Jesse was the one who had the final say. He made the decisions. He was the man. So let's take a look at this. So here's the cow column now. So there's, at least 1,000 cows. I don't know how many, but if just Jesse and his brothers had about 800, that would mean that all the other people also in the cow column had cows. It had to have been well over 1,000. And so now there's like 500-ish people somewhere in there and about 60 wagons in the cow column. So here is a picture of an old wagon train. This is not Jesse's wagon train, but it's just a picture for you so you can get an idea of what it was like. Now this wagon train is stopped. Maybe they stopped for lunch or something like that, because typically there was a little more space between the wagons. Jesse Applegate said that his wagon train of 60 wagons would be spread out about 3/4 of a mile. So they had some space between them. So I told you, Jesse was the captain. There was also someone who served as pilot. That's what they called him. And he would ride his horse for miles and miles and miles ahead of the wagon train. And he would scout out, the best spot to stop for lunch, or the best spot to circle up the wagons at night. And even if, there was a creek or a river up ahead, the pilot would ride the horse along the water to find the best spot for the wagons to cross. And they also had cattle herders. So first there would be, all of the wagons, the whole wagon train, and then behind the wagon train would come all of the cows. Now, if you've ever seen a cow, it was probably standing still and eating, right? I think that's their favorite thing to do. So they had to have men on horses to keep the cows moving all day long. They had to keep up with the wagon train. And so they had to just make sure they weren't stopping for snacks or anything like that. Now, they also had people who served as night guards. So they would take turns staying awake for a while at night just to keep an eye on everything, make sure the cows were safe and everything was fine. And then they also had daily rotations. So Jesse gave each wagon a number. And so see how this wagon here is in front? If he's in front today, then he's going to be the very last one tomorrow. And that's because the wagons in the front took the most damage. There wasn't a trail. I mean, no one had done this before with a whole bunch of wagons. So there wasn't an actual, road or path or a flat place for the wheels to go over. They had to go over all of these plants and any rocks or any sticks that might be in the way. So those first wagons would take more damage going over those things. And by the time the last wagons got there, it was pretty flat. It was a lot flatter. So it was harder on the wagons in the front. But the wagons in the back, they had to breathe in all the dust and dirt that was kicked up by all the wagons before them. So there wasn't really a great place to be in line. And so that's why they would rotate every day just to keep it fair. Now, it was so organized. I mean, so organized. They would wake up at 4:00 in the morning and they would roll out by 7 a.m. And they did this every day. And because Jesse Applegate was so good at leading and making these decisions and being organized, the cow column actually made it to Oregon before the light column. How crazy is that? So Jesse Applegate actually led the first wagon train on the Oregon Trail that made it to Oregon. That's just incredible. See how cool he is? Now, they had to get all of those cows and all those wagons and people all the way over here. And eventually they made it to a place called Fort Hall, which is in, modern day Idaho. But at the time, it was actually in Oregon country, but it wasn't where they were, planning to stop. They were coming over here. So anyway, they get to Fort Hall and they meet a couple explorers who had just been over this way and had come back. And these explorers see, here's Jesse Applegate and here's 60 wagons and here's all these cows. And the explorers are like, I don't think you're going to be able to get wagons through there. You probably shouldn't do it. And so some of the people actually turned and followed those explorers down to California instead, which is down over here. But Jesse was determined. He was going to follow this path. He was going to get over to the Willamette Valley. And so they continued on, and they had people ride ahead. Even Jesse did sometimes. They would be on horses, they'd ride up ahead with axes, and they would chop down trees so that they could clear a way for the wagons to all come through. So things were getting harder at this point. Now, eventually, they made it to Fort Walla Walla up here. And this is where things took a major turn. So they realized that they were going to have to actually go down the Columbia River, not just across it. They had to go down it. Now, if you have learned about the Oregon Trail or you've played the Oregon Trail game, you know that eventually the pioneers found ways to build rafts, and they would put their wagons on the rafts and they would cross the river. And it was still, very dangerous because sometimes they would tip over and they would lose everything. But this was the first time that this was being done by a wagon train. So they didn't come up with that idea just yet. So they're in, Fort Walla Walla, and they're like, oh my goodness, we have to go down the river. What are we going to do? And so Jesse sold his cows. They couldn't take their cows the rest of the way. After all of that effort, getting those cows so far, he had to sell his cows. And then he also left his wagon. They left their wagons in Fort Walla Walla and said, we'll be back someday. Please keep an eye on our stuff. And then the Applegate brothers got some driftwood from, the edges of the Columbia River. They pulled the wood out and they used their tools and they built boats. They actually built boats. So they had to move stuff from their wagons into the boats and then sail the boats down the river. Now here's another map. So right here, this is where they built the boats. Here's Fort Walla Walla, like I was just showing you. Now they had to go all the way down the river, down here to Fort Vancouver, and then they could come down this way to the Willamette Valley. But if you look close, right here, you'll see this. It says Site of Disaster, November 1843. Oh my goodness. And right here, there are some rapids. So here's what happened. One of the boats that the Applegate brothers had built, they were going down the river and one of them capsized. That means it went underwater, flipped over, whatever. And there had been people on that boat. And two of those people were 9-year-old boys. Now, one of those 9-year-old boys was Jesse Applegate's oldest son, Edward, and he loved him so much. And then the other boy was Jesse Applegate's brother's son, named Warren. And of course, Lindsay Applegate loved his son very, very much. And the families were just devastated, absolutely devastated by this. But they had to continue on. They had to go down the rest of the river. It was awful. And so Jesse and Lindsay, they were like, this was terrible. This was a terrible, terrible trail. That's awful. And they didn't want anyone in the future to have to go through this and lose a child or anyone in the Columbia River. And so they said, you know what? We need to find a better trail. We need to find a safer path for future pioneers so that this never happens to another family. So anyway, when they first got there, keep in mind, it's November. And if you're from this part of Oregon, it's very cold and very wet in the winter. And so here they were. They were very cold, they were very wet, and they were very hungry. They had to hunt for the food that they were going to eat. And they had to use the furs to make clothes if they needed clothes. It was very hard and just very difficult. So it took them a couple years actually before they were able to build themselves a farm and have crops that were growing and just to be stable, right? So it was 3 years later when they decided it was time to find another trail. So it was 1846. And Jesse and Lindsay said, all right, it's time. Now they joined with 13 other men. So they had a group of 15 men. And Dallas, right here, Dallas, Oregon, this is where they had the Applegate brothers had their farms. And so they set off from Dallas and they went south. Now, if you remember, Jesse Applegate was a surveyor back in Missouri. And so he still had his tools, and he used those tools to take measurements all along the way and find the best spot to have wagon trains coming through. And so if you follow these X's on the map, they go all the way down to Northern California, and then they come over this way and they keep on going. Now, at some point, everybody except Jesse Applegate stopped, and they were just like camping and they were waiting. And then Jesse went on ahead and he wound up at Fort Hall. Now, if you remember, it was Fort Hall where those two explorers saw Jesse and his wagon train, and they were like, don't do it. Don't even try it. Well, now it was Jesse's turn, and Jesse saw some pioneers coming in their wagons, and he said, hey guys, I've been over this trail. It's very, very dangerous. I think I found a much safer way. Follow me. And so they did. They turned and they followed Jesse on what is now known as the Applegate Trail. And they followed him and then met up with the other 14 men, and they were led right up to the Willamette Valley. And so for the next few years, thousands of pioneers coming over to Oregon country, they would follow the Applegate Trail. And so now it's a national historic trail, and there are little they're not mile markers, but historic markers all the way down I-5. So if you're familiar with the Interstate 5 follows Jesse Applegate's trail. It's very, very cool. Now, here is the part that I think is probably the coolest. So Jesse Applegate had, quite a few children, and one of them was a boy named Robert Applegate. Now, Robert Applegate grew up and he got married and he had kids, and one of those kids was a girl named Anna Applegate. Now, she married a man named John McCurdy. He was Scottish, and he went by Jack. But anyway, so they got married and they had kids, and one of those kids was a man named Thomas McCurdy. So then Thomas McCurdy got married and he had a few kids, and one of those kids was named Kenneth McCurdy. And then Kenneth McCurdy grew up and he married the most beautiful woman who has ever lived. And they had two boys, and one of those boys was named James McCurdy. And then James grew up and he got married and he had two kids, and one of them was named Monica McCurdy. And that is me. So Jesse Applegate is actually my great, 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 great grandfather.